Wheelbarrow Cult. My mother left us when I was 6 years old. She had an affair with a colleague, which turned into a relationship. My father got full custody of me, and that big part of our lives just vanished. It seemed to happen overnight. 1 year later, my mother moved to the Rossiter and was expecting her second child, my future half-brother Charles. My father never really recovered from this. He tried dating again, but a certain level of trust is something you just can't regain. Time passed, and we held our two halves of the family together. And although my relationship with my mother never fully recovered, we stayed in touch. It was a sporadic connection, but still, there was contact, if only to fend off the fear that something might happen. Then there was Charles, my half-brother. I didn't know him, and yet everything about his existence was always surrounded by a kind of dark cloud. I didn't hate him for who he was, but for what he represented, a reminder of the hardest time in my youth. I hated him. I couldn't help it. I knew nothing about him, but I hated him anyway. But I didn't pay much attention to Charles or his escapades. He was just someone I vaguely knew, living his own life. Occasionally I'd see a high school photo or a recommendation from his Spotify playlist. He was just some guy. I wasn't there to celebrate any of his birthdays, and he didn't celebrate any of mine. In 2017, Charles turned 21. I saw some pictures of a big party, and there was an open invitation for anyone who wanted to come. I'm sure I could have gone if I wanted to, but it was never really up for discussion. By that point, I had my own life, and repairing that bridge seemed pointless. It's like trying to change something you've worked on your whole life. What's the point of fixing a bridge when you're already an Olympic swimmer? Something like that. Behind the scenes, though, things were happening that I wouldn't find out about until much later. For instance, Charles had been suffering from anxiety since middle school. He was plagued by phobias and panic attacks. He struggled to keep up in school, and most of his friends were superficial at best, the kind of people who turn away when things get tough. I had no idea about any of this, but I was about to become more involved in his life than I ever wanted. It was late July 2013. I was on my way home from a long shift and had grabbed some groceries when my phone rang. I was loading the last paper bag into the car, threw an apologetic look at my girlfriend, and answered the call. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her personally in years. "Hey, Blue Jay," she sighed. "I'm sorry it's been so long." My first reaction was anger. How dare she still call me that? My stomach churned like I had swallowed something rotten, but I bit my lip and managed to stay polite. "Everything all right?" She wanted something. She'd never call me without a reason. "It's about your brother," she said. "I don't know what to do." "I don't have a brother, but you do," she sighed. "You have one, and I think he needs you." She explained the situation as best she could. To get his issues under control, Charles had started seeking guidance from people outside his usual social circles. At first it was harmless, spiritual guides and miracle healers. He had studied Buddhism and Hinduism to broaden his horizons, trying everything from yoga to online survival groups. But lately, everything had changed. One thing led to another, Mum explained, and now he's just so quiet. Isn't that a good thing? "Charles used to tell me everything," she sighed. "That's not like him. I can't get through to him anymore." "Why don't you just call the police? He's an adult now. There was a pause. She was clearly upset and trying to pull herself together. A harsh tone probably wasn't helping. "I think he's fallen in with the wrong people." She reached out to me because she thought I was distant enough to stay under the radar, someone who wouldn't be questioned too much. Everyone else in Charles's life seemed to be blacklisted, turned away at the door. But maybe an unknown half-brother could get through to him. At least, that's what she claimed. "I know I can't force you," she said, "but I think it would do us all some good." "So family's important to you now, huh?" She stayed silent, and I just shook my head. My girlfriend could feel my frustration as I sat down in the car and leaned over to hug me. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been gripping the steering wheel until I saw my knuckles turning white. "You don't have to believe me," Mum said, "but it's true. It really is." Then she hung up. For days, I wrestled with myself. Charles had never done anything to hurt me, but I couldn't help hating him. It was hard to tell whether that hatred was stronger than the queasy feeling in my stomach. Even at my angriest, I couldn't bring myself to want to hurt him on purpose. I just couldn't. So I decided to help. Nothing else mattered. At the very least, I could show her that I'd turned out to be a good person, even without her help. I texted her, asking for all the information she had and booked a flight for the following week. She sent me tons of emails with photos, descriptions, and videos, but I didn't take the time to sit down and go through them all. So I headed to Florida with only a vague idea of what was going on. According to Mum, it had all started with a nightmare. She told me that Charles had been having recurring nightmares about a boy in blue. He'd called her late at night, half asleep, telling her about them. These nightmares had taken over his life, and he was trying to find subtle ways to cope. To an outsider, they looked like just another one of his many anxieties, a fixed belief he couldn't shake. There were pictures of his apartment. He'd removed the curtains from the windows so the boy in blue could see him if needed. Later, he decided to start sleeping outside. Apparently, the clear blue sky was calming for him. And there were other little things. He'd started wearing more formal shirts, cut his hair, and began growing strange flowers in his front yard. Then, he just disappeared. The first place I checked was his apartment. No curtains, just like Mum had said. I could see right in, and it was clear that the place hadn't been lived in for a while. I had a feeling something had happened there. It just seemed too bleak. A 20-something who's into religion and philosophy but doesn't leave behind a single book? Nothing. The place was abandoned. At least the sunflowers he'd planted were doing all right, though I didn't like the shade of blue they had. They looked unnatural. The last clue was the pile of mail at his door. A mountain of it. We're talking several months of unpaid bills and notices. But then there was the real issue. The community he'd gotten involved with. The Church of the 12 Heavenly Congregation. They didn't have much of a presence on social media and didn't post much. It seemed like a normal group, young people smiling, offering companionship and understanding in their flyers. It was so ordinary that I felt like I'd seen it before. I had a stroke of luck though, as it turned out there was an event being held that day. It probably wasn't the smartest idea, but I figured it was a good opportunity to get my foot in the door. Their social media didn't say much about it, but from what I could gather, they had a branch at Lake Parrish, although it seemed to be members only. So I drove to Bradenton Beach, hoping to see this group in action. As it turned out, it wasn't as difficult as I'd imagined. They had a small stand set up by the beach, handing out flyers. From a distance, you might have thought it was a promotion for energy drinks. About a dozen beach-ready young people, all eagerly chatting away. It all seemed so fake. Still, I took a chance. I tightened my sandals, strolled around a bit, and pretended to be passing by. It didn't take long before a young man and woman approached me, their smiles as bright as the flyers they were handing out. "Excuse me," they smiled. "Are you having a good day?" "Can't complain," I smiled back. "Are you selling something?" "No," they both giggled. "Just spreading good vibes," and I soon had a flyer in my hand. I stuck around, chatting with them a little. As a whole, this organization didn't seem too weird, but when you picked it apart, you started to notice inconsistencies. For example, their logo. For a church called the Church of the 12 Heavenly Congregation, you'd expect clouds or maybe a cross, but no, their logo was a wheelbarrow. One of those old wooden ones. I counted the spokes on the wheel, but there were only 7. Even that didn't line up. Then there were the members themselves. I got the sense that they weren't really passionate about what they were doing. They seemed disengaged, and their lines felt rehearsed, as though they weren't true members of the church, but were just being paid to be there. The way they spoke when they thought no one was listening confirmed that too. It was all just an act. But to what end? "Are you the folks up at, Black Parish?" I asked. "I think I've seen the logo before." "That's just the administration," the woman answered quickly. "We're in 7 different cities across the state, and it takes a lot of people to keep everything running." She immediately became defensive. I tried to steer the conversation away from confrontation and instead talked about their gatherings and other members, but they were already annoyed. It wasn't until one of the other attendees approached that I felt like I might be getting somewhere. He was a man in his early 50s, with short blonde hair and a sizable belly. He wore large dark sunglasses, a white shirt, and a blue tie. He patted the others on the shoulder and smiled at me. "You strike me as a man with a lot of questions, my friend," he asked. "That's me," I replied. "Not many places left where you can ask questions these days." "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, turning his back on me. I must have said something that spooked him. I was left with no choice but to call after him. "The boy in blue," I called. It was the first thing that came to mind. It had been the central theme in Charles's stories, so it had to mean something. The man turned around, squinting at me over his glasses and adjusting them. "The boy in blue, huh? Yeah, he keeps me up at night." "I can imagine," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder and taking a deep breath. Finally, his eyes met mine, and this time, his smile was genuine. "Maybe we do have a few things to discuss." I spent the rest of the day talking to this man. His name was Isaiah, and he was one of the rising members of the church. He'd only been with them for a few months and was still finding his feet, but what I said resonated with him. The boy in blue was a central theme within the inner circle of the church. They claimed it was a prophetic vision, a guide for the things to come. Later that afternoon, as we wrapped up for the day, Isaiah and I returned to the tent they'd set up near the beach. I almost tripped over a wheelbarrow they had there and couldn't help but ask about it. "That's an unusual emblem," I said. "I'll give you that." Isaiah chuckled, "But it means you've got to push yourself beyond your usual abilities." "That's a lot to ask of a wheelbarrow," I joked. "We're not asking anything of the wheelbarrow," he smiled. "It's about you. You're the one who has to lift it, but it's there if you need it." Once I'd established a bit of rapport, I began to develop a temporary routine. Every night, I'd call my girlfriend to keep her updated. I'd also send the occasional text to my mom, but I couldn't bring myself to actually talk to her. Afternoons were spent messaging Isaiah, trying to keep a low profile while hoping for an invitation to something else. If I could just meet the other members, maybe I'd run into Charles. Maybe I wouldn't be able to get him out of there. But at least I could make sure he was all right. Over the next week, I met up with Isaiah a few more times, once for lunch and another time at another event. I was invited to help print flyers and set up the tent, and I agreed. The flyer itself wasn't particularly interesting, just the logo, the address of an office downtown, and an inspirational quote about reaching for the heavens. Not much more than that. I got the impression that handing out the flyers was primarily a pretext for having conversations with people rather than spreading a message. The more time I spent with Isaiah, the more I realized this wasn't just a church. There were no priests, no preachers, and no grand gatherings. If anything, they seemed to stick to a routine. Everything pointed to the Lake Parish site. Something was going on there, and Isaiah was my way in. I had to take a risk. By the time I met him for the third time, I hadn't showered in 3 days. I pretended I was living out of my car, and he bought the lie. Tough breakup, huh? Isaiah was a bit taken aback but understanding as the gears in his head began to turn. "Ah, that's tough, mate," he said. "She was a good one." It was an innocent remark, but it held an unsettling revelation. He knew what my girlfriend looked like, even though I'd never shown him a photo. Had they been spying on me? "I guess that's why you're out here, eh? Fresh start?" "I'm just in a rough patch," I said, barely getting any sleep. No, I get it," he said. "I've been there too. But sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, you know?" His comment made me pause. This wasn't a man trying to recruit me into a cult. This was a man trying to keep me away from one. It was a warning, not an invitation. "Anything's better than that," he sighed, looking me dead in the eye, clearly concerned, and then gestured towards a wheelbarrow nearby. "All right." Sometime later, we drove out to Black Parish. The drive was quiet, with Isaiah behind the wheel, no radio, no small talk. If anything, he seemed to regret the trip, like he didn't want me to go through with it. We passed a sign that said we were on private property and soon arrived at a chain-link fence. Isaiah pulled out a key for the padlock. The place wasn't what I'd expected. 3 single-story buildings in a field, fenced off and surrounded by trees. The knee-high grass made the place feel abandoned. A handful of people in white shirts moved between the buildings, pointing at each other and chatting animatedly. "So, what am I in for?" I asked. "Do we all have the same problem?" "Yeah, mate," he said, "but not everyone's ready to face it." He looked up at me but didn't meet my eyes. He seemed uncertain. "Talk to Miss Mella first," he said, "then keep going." I had some time to look around the grounds and search for Charles. There was an area between the three buildings that looked like a gathering place. The ground was leveled, the grass was mowed, and 6 wheelbarrows were lined up along the side. I don't know why, but when I saw them, I felt uneasy. They all had dark stains on them. By then, there were probably about a dozen people there. Isaiah got back in his car and drove away, leaving me alone to talk to Miss Mella. She had an office at the western end of the front building, almost like a reception area. I couldn't believe how sparse the room was. Here and there, a logo, a wheelbarrow, and that was it. The place was sterile, even smelled like a hospital. Miss Miller was an older woman with short gray hair and thick glasses. She asked me to come in, hand over my phone, keys, and wallet, and sit down across from her to fill out a form. The form asked for all sorts of personal information, including passwords and usernames for various social media accounts. What surprised me most, though, was the second page, which focused on my supposed anxiety. There were 3 lines where I was supposed to describe my encounter with the boy in blue. I just made something up and tried to keep the small talk going. Miss Miller, however, didn't have much to say. She assured me that help was available, but I had to be completely honest. I tried asking her about the other members whom she called patients and how they were dealing with things. She replied as follows: "What you're experiencing isn't your fault," she explained. "It's not the will of a god or Satan or anything in between. It's beyond our understanding. Therefore, the steps we must take to stop it might seem drastic." What followed was a brief health check. I had to fill out a medical form and have my blood drawn. Surprisingly, there seemed to be a lot of medical professionals around, while others looked like they had a corporate background. I noticed many boxes with the logo of a certain pharmaceutical company that looked like some kind of axe or hatchet. When everything seemed in order, I was led to a separate room at the other end of the compound, a long corridor with locked doors from which I could hear moaning and crying. A nurse hurried past me with an armful of bloody bedsheets. Miss Miller led me to a single room. There wasn't much in it: a bathroom, a bed, and a nightstand. No windows, and the door was locked from the outside. I only noticed the latter when I heard the click of the lock. I was probably locked in that room for most of the day. I could hear the people in the other rooms. Most of them weren't saying anything coherent. Some were crying, others were screaming, and only one person was trying to stay calm and politely asking for help. All of this came from muffled voices behind closed doors. I had no way of checking, but I believe it lasted about 12 hours in total. I arrived early in the morning, and when the door finally opened, it was already dark outside. My first thought was to get out of there, but I was already in too deep. I'd invested too much, and I just had to see this through. If Charles was stuck in this place, it was time to get him out. When one of the nurses let me out, she handed me a wicker basket with various toiletries and a set of fresh clothes. Cleaned up and groomed, I was lined up with other people. Some looked quite worn out, while others didn't seem to realize what was going on. There was a woman who could barely stand and had to lean on one of the nurses for support. Looking at her, it was easy to forget that this was supposed to be a religious organization. It felt more like a hospital. We were brought to the center of the compound, where about a dozen carers and 9 other people like me had been gathered. They turned on a series of spotlights that bathed the courtyard in harsh light. That's when I saw Charles. He must have lost at least 15 kilos. The guy was nothing but skin and bones. His hair had fallen out, and his face was a patchy, unshaven mess. He looked absolutely wrecked. I couldn't imagine he'd even recognize me, even if he were healthy. But now that I'd seen him, I was glad to be there. I'd help him somehow. I just had to get through whatever was coming. We all stood in a circle, each with a wheelbarrow in front of us. The others lifted theirs by the handles, and one by one, we were given a pill. People took them without question. I only heard one objection: someone wasn't sure, but they were simply asked whether they wanted help or not. They did, so the pill was swallowed. When it was my turn, I just shook my head. No thanks. Then we'll have to ask you to leave, the nurse said. I looked around the circle. I was holding up the line. There was no question here. If you wanted help, you had to take the pill. So I did. It was some kind of muscle relaxant, not a strong hallucinogen or anything like that. Just something that made my shoulders droop and slurred my speech. However, as I looked around, it seemed to have a massive effect on the others. The nurses moved from patient to patient, jotting down what was said and making notes on a form if something was of particular interest. Most of the people were muttering incoherently, but some of them were strangely lucid. Some mentioned places, things, and vague descriptions of events. Some of the nurses asked pointed questions or even made demands. Let him show you the Portuguese election, one of the nurses said. Do you see anything? I was also asked to describe my experience. I just repeated some of what I'd heard from others. I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. They wanted to shine a small light in my face, but before they could, one of the men next to me snapped. He was in his early 40s and didn't look particularly remarkable. Fairly fit, a bit shorter than average, bald, and wearing a pair of crooked reading glasses. His knuckles had turned white, and he began shaking his wheelbarrow, his eyes rolling back in his head. Fire! He screamed. I see fire. The nurses rushed to him. Yes, he's showing me a fire, he screamed. Screams, a highway blocked by fallen trees, late autumn, November, crackling bark, blackening bark. Do you see a license plate? One of the nurses asked. Do you see a number? Oh, and Harry. One of them ran off, speaking loudly into a phone. Others stepped back, and we all watched the man expectantly. Yes, he's releasing me, the man said. I'm free. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The nurses turned away as if they were shocked, but I didn't look away, although I wished I had. His voice grew distant, his jaw clenched, and his tongue swelled just like his stomach. Seconds later, there was a loud pop. Blood and guts poured out of him, filling the wheelbarrow. Then, another pop as his tongue did the same. Finally, he just stood there, bleeding out, still holding the wheelbarrow. It was the only thing stopping him from collapsing onto the ground, and no one reacted. No one flinched, ran, or screamed. There was just this eerie silence. I felt panic rising in my chest, but I tried not to stand out. Who knows what they'd do if they knew I was faking all of this? About half a minute later, the same thing happened to someone else. The nurses were shouting instructions to each other, confirming what they'd heard. Fire, Terrio, late November. They took these people to be healed, but every bone in my body was telling me to run, to just grab Charles and get the hell out of there. But as I looked at the dead man to my left, who still stood there holding his wheelbarrow, some primal part of me refused to move. I felt like an antelope watching a lion pass by. A twitch of the leg could make it pounce. I had to wait. They grilled and prodded the people with their questions. 4 people seemed to have something to share, and those same 4 people burst open like overripe melons. Their faces had this look of relief, as if it was some kind of reward. That's what they had been aiming for. The thought crossed my mind that maybe this was what Charles was waiting for. I looked at him as his head began to sway from side to side, his eyes rolling back. I couldn't wait any longer. I took my first steps toward him. At first, no one noticed, but as I moved faster, the others called out, telling me to stop, to wait, to listen. But as I saw Charles's hands clenching the handles of the wheelbarrow and his voice rising in pitch, I stopped thinking about the consequences. I had to do something, anything. So I tackled him, and in that moment, as I touched him, something in me shattered. I looked into his face as the world changed. I was standing on a highway in the middle of dozens of wrecked cars. Around us, burning trees were falling, and hundreds of people were screaming. Charles was there. We were running in the wrong direction, watching as people in their cars suffocated. Others were running into the forest, dying of suffocation too. Further down the road stood a child, a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed entirely in blue. We were trying to reach him. Charles turned to me. "He's showing us," he said. "We need to keep going." I grabbed him and threw him to the ground. I could feel the asphalt beneath my hands and taste the burning oaks. But it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. In the blink of an eye, we were in a plane, plummeting through the sky. The oxygen masks had already dropped, and people were screaming as an alarm blared. At the end of the aisle, there was that little boy in blue again waiting for us to come closer. He wanted to show us more. "He's trying to save us," Charles cried. "He needs me." No. Another blink, and I was standing on a beach, watching a cruise ship slowly capsize. I forced myself to look away so I wouldn't see the name. I grabbed Charles's face and forced his eyes to focus on mine. Blink after blink. Earthquakes, gunshots, fires, lightning strikes, floods, crumbling dams, collapsing bridges, knives, guns, hangings in front of cheering crowds. Death, death, death. Then, for a brief moment, it was gas again. Back in that field on that compound. People were after us. Charles lay beside me, clutching his stomach. I bent down, grabbed him under the arm, and pulled him to his feet. If I had to drag him out of there, I was ready to do so. Blink. A congregation standing in a massive cathedral as the ceiling collapsed, idols and Latin hymns shattering, dark shadows in the distance, creeping closer. Then back again. Screams all around me. Another patient had burst on the other side of the field, filling yet another wheelbarrow. Blink, blink, blink. Soon it became harder to tell the screams apart. Some came from the nurses, some from the patients, and others, who knows where they came from. Everything was chaos, but still, I carried Charles step by step to the front gates, trying not to let him stare at anything for too long. His stomach was literally churning, physically writhing. His eyes were darting around, and his tongue was so swollen, his words became nothing more than moans. I had to get him away, distract him, anything. I closed my eyes, a wave of hot, sulfur-smelling air, an endless highway, waves of red sand beating against us from all sides, burning our skin. Chattering bones lined the roadside, the remnants of countless dead. In the distance, the boy in blue beckoned me to look closer, to let myself be drawn in like the others. But I held my eyes shut, as did Charles. "You need to know," a voice whispered directly in my ear. "You need to see." Something was pressed into my hand. I resisted, screamed as I felt the sand burrow into my skin. Suddenly, I was sitting in a car. There was a soft winter light, the click of a seatbelt, and then a sudden acceleration. I thought it was another vision, but it lasted too long. A gate crashed open. I was in the back seat of a car with Charles, who was curled up, crying hysterically. In the front seat was Isaiah, flooring the accelerator. "I'm sorry," he gasped, as he swerved the car onto the highway. "This is the only way to stop it. It's the only way to end it." And so we sped off into the night.